Hello, I'm Rupert Isaacson, author of The Long Ride Home and The Horse Boy and The Healing Land. I just thought I would read a little bit from the beginning of The Long Ride Home, just to give you an idea of how we were facing this complete crisis at the beginning of the story and how we sort of found our way through it. So, here we go. In 2004, my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism. Completely stunned and unsure where to turn for help, we floundered around like most parents of newly diagnosed special needs kids in the shock of the diagnosis. It had been presented to us as a catastrophe. I regret to inform you, Mr. Isaacson, that your son has a diagnosis of autism. There's no cure. The therapies are going to cost you about $100,000 a year that you don't have. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to limit your life to a rigid schedule of daily activities written on a piece of paper on your fridge because your child will never be able to deal with change. And if you don't do these things, you'll completely lose your child, who's actually kind of lost anyway. So goodbye and good luck, and that'll be $100 for the consultation, please. No wonder parents of autistic children despair initially, until that other part of them asks, hold on, is this the complete picture? Can it really be that bad? Well, yes it can. Tantrums like tsunamis, like storm fronts moving in from nowhere, erupting even in sleep. No language. My son was floating away from me, absent, not there. So tantalizingly affectionate one moment and so lost the next. Enough to break any parent's heart. But I did notice one thing. Despite my son's endless tantrums, his obsessive behavior, he just became better outdoors. He tantrumed less, seemed happier, more present. So we spent hours and hours exploring the little trails in the woods behind our house. You can see them out of the window there. In the Texas countryside, 30 minutes from the city of Austin. I wasn't working. My wife Kristen was teaching at the university where she was a junior professor of psychology. My journalism, which routinely took me to Africa and other parts of the world to report on the environment and human rights, had dried up since Rowan's diagnosis. Autism is a full-time thing. Usually one half of the couple gives up their career, at least in the early years. Single parents have an unimaginably hard time of it. And into the bargain, I'd given up my principal passion in life, horses. Because I assumed that my wild, uncontrollable, 2.5-year-old, non-verbal, raging bundle of utter enigmaticness would not be safe around horses. So, into the woods we went. Much as I love nature, being outside in Texas from April until October can be pretty uncomfortable. Hellishly hot and humid, and with everything nature can throw at you, from mosquitoes, fire ants, bull nettle, poison ivy, poison oak, poison sumac, to chiggers, and if you've never had them, you'll shudder, and if you've ever had them, you'll just shudder and start itching just hearing that word. Brown recluse and black widow spiders, 4 species of venomous snake. There's a reason why people in the American South spend much of the year inside with the air conditioning on. But Rowan needed to move. So out onto the sweaty trails we'd go for hours at a time, under the elms and blackberries, under elms and hackberries, me tagging behind in lonely silence as he dashed ahead, chirruping to himself in his private language from which I was firmly excluded, swatting at the flies and mosquitoes as I lumbered along. I wondered if this was it. This is what life would be like from now on. Following in the wake of a child who didn't communicate, didn't really engage with us, who seemed to be floating away from us no matter what we tried. Our marriage was suffering too. Badly. Kristen's parents, long since divorced, were about as far away as it's possible to be. Her mother in Seattle, her father in Copenhagen in Denmark. My parents lived in London, though both were Southern African by birth. They had brought me up in England, but had always retained a strong link with Africa, hence my journalism and human rights activity down there. For ours had been somewhat of a political family. Some of our cousins in jail for fighting against apartheid, others actively helping the regime. With offshoots in Zimbabwe, Botswana and Namibia, we were colonials through and through. But all that meant for me and Kristen, far away in Texas, was that we had no babysitters. And none of our friends could cope with Rowan's emotional and, though we didn't know it then, neurological firestorms. let alone the incontinence. Having no one else to turn to, no safety valve of any kind, Kristen and I began to eat at each other. And as all couples know, that can only go on for so long. So there I was, traipsing behind Rowan, passing under the big post oak, through the evergreen Yopon holly, as we headed for the Mustang grapevine he liked to swing from, when instead of heading to the right along the trail as he normally did, he suddenly switched direction and charged to the left, barging through the undergrowth, faster than I could follow because of all the thick bushes, and faster than I could grab him. He'd got through my neighbour Stafford's fence and into his horse pasture. As sod's law would have it, all 5 of Stafford's horses were grazing right there by the fence. In a flash, Rowan was in among them, throwing himself on his back, impossibly vulnerable and exposed, among the horses' hooves, giggling and gurgling up at them, and as they looked down at him, snorting their surprise. My God, I thought, he's going to get killed. The very situation I tried to avoid by giving up horse riding in the first place. So there I was, creeping up to the fence, ready to grab Rowan by the collar or shirt tail and drag him to safety before the horses trampled him. Except they didn't trample him. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Gently, very gently, Betsy, the grumpy lead mare of the herd, pushed the other horses away. Alpha mares are not usually so polite. Normally, if she'd wanted the herd to move out of her space in a hurry, Betsy would have rushed at them with nipping teeth or maybe spun around with a hard kick, the very behaviour I was so afraid of. Yet instead, she nudged them gently with her nose, and even more surprising, they moved away without the usual bucking, stomping protest that subordinate members of a herd usually display when the dominant one bosses them around. Then Betsy lowered her head towards Rowan, still lying there in the grass, laughing delightedly, and began to lick and chew with her lips, half closing her eyes. When a horse does this, it's a gesture of submission and acceptance, not dissimilar to when a dog rolls over and shows its belly. Horse trainers use various techniques to get to this stage with a horse, but I'd never seen a horse spontaneously show submission to a human being like this before, much less a babbling, non-verbal, autistic toddler lying on his back in the grass. Something was passing between them, something magical. Clearly, Rowan had the same kind of connection with horses that I had, probably more so, for Betsy's behaviour was way, way outside the norm. This seemed to be something purer, more direct. And I'll never share it with him, I thought, because of his autism. And with that, I burst into tears. Fortunately, I turned out to be completely, 100% wrong. And so began the most radical and positive change in our lives.